Consumer Price Index. The order also makes further supplementary increases to the level of veterans' pensions. I commend this bill to the House.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Mr. Speaker. Charles Chevelle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is an annual ritual, the introduction on first reading of the Subordinate Legislation Confirmation and Validation Bill. And unfortunately, it has become a ritual. The Minister quite correctly said that these pieces of legislation dealt with in the bill are traditionally a matter for cross-party support, and certainly that isn't changing today. But what I want to do is try to make some observations about the utility of the process, because I think in the spirit of the House trying to do its job better, there are some ways that we could explore in order to use the time of members more efficiently in respect of this sort of exercise. I was perhaps encouraged by the Minister's motion of referral, because I note that it proposes a report back date of Guy Fawkes Day, the 5th of November. And it might well be that that ought to inspire us to rethink the way in which this legislation is dealt with on an annual basis by the Parliament. I want members and those listening to have a very clear picture of what will happen from here. This legislation, if it passes its first reading, will be referred to the Regulations Review Committee. And the Minister made a reference to the valuable scrutiny that the committee will perform, and that's kind of him. Unfortunately, this is what the Regulations Review Committee will do. It will write to each Minister and Department responsible for one of the orders dealt with by the legislation. And the letter that the committee writes to the Minister and his or her department will ask whether or not there is an ongoing need for the particular order that is being validated and confirmed. The Minister or his or her department will invariably write back and say to the committee, yes, there is an ongoing need for another year, or whatever the term for the confirmation or confirmation and validation is. The Regulations Review Committee, having no way to test that, will accept the advice that comes back, and it will report to the House that the legislation referred to in this bill ought to be confirmed or validated and confirmed, as the case may be. So that is the extent of the scrutiny that will come from the Regulations Review Committee, and I can tell the House that as the chair of the committee in this term, the deputy chair from the last committee is present in the House. He'll remember that was exactly what was done last time. And the problem that we have with this system is that these subordinate legislation, confirmation and validation bills have been done by this Parliament for many, many, many decades. They date back to an earlier era where there just wasn't the sort of scrutiny that we have now with our committee system, with the fact that committee stages in the House are recorded in Hansard, so people can actually see the detailed level of scrutiny that is performed in respect of legislation. And they date back to an earlier time when thinking around subordinate legislation was very different to the way that thinking occurs now. And all we're doing by dealing with an annual bill like this is trying to preserve the form of the principle that all expenditure and all revenue raising by the Crown ought to be authorised by the House, by the legislature. That's all this exercise is designed to achieve, to preserve the principle and the form of that notion. But as I've said, it is simply a ritualistic exercise. Much work, sir, has been done on what it costs to run this House per minute. There are various exercises that indicate the expense that the taxpayers are put to as this House operates. There are actually more important and more significant things that we could be doing than dealing with this sort of annual exercise every year, and this is precisely the speech and form that I gave last year when we dealt with this sort of legislation. It cannot be beyond the expertise of the Standing Orders Committee and the expert advice that it receives from the clerk to be able to find a better way to deal with this sort of exercise. And I think I would say that the beginning point ought to be that we should no longer legislate annually to continue with this type of exercise, and we should no longer have primary legislation that requires ongoing confirmation or confirmation and validation, because it is an outdated exercise. There are easier ways to do it. We could just deal with each of these matters in primary legislation, or we could simply delegate a particular power to a minister to deal with by way of order and have it scrutinised by the Regulations Review Committee in the ordinary course, which would happen in respect of regulations and new regulation-making powers every year generally. We don't need to spend the time of the House in this way, and given the referral date of Guy Fawkes Day, I'm hoping that the Regulations Review Committee will agree to report to the House not only in terms of the enactments dealt with in the bill, but also to ask that we actually find a better way to use the House's time rather than have an annual subordinate legislation confirmation and validation bill, which, as I've said, predates the modern scrutiny methods that are now at our disposal and is not by any measure an efficient use of the time of the House.
I call Mike Sabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.